All right. Well, good morning. My name is Molly Dugan, and I'm so grateful to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'd especially like to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Katie Dyer, who we met over email. And she invited me to come. And it's really wonderful and pretty humbling. There's one other journalist in the room, and I'm around a bunch of people in science and psychology and all of these different fields with which I am a lot less familiar. So I'm already learning a whole lot, and really, again, appreciate you having me. And I really appreciate, of course, the previous presentation on AI. I was reading a New Yorker story this morning about AI and professors and how it's ruining our lives. So, my goal today, besides talking a little bit about media literacy, is not to have a what about trees moment. And but one of the things that I thought was really, really interesting is in some of the conversations, a lot of the kind of skepticism that you were invoking are things that are very real in journalism. There are three basic pillars for reporting that I teach my students, and the first one is humility. So when we were talking about intellectual humility yesterday, I really related to that because, of course, journalists have to be humble in order to ask people questions. You have to be open to other people and ideas in order to really capture important information and capture multiple perspectives. Another one of those pillars is transparency. We're supposed to say what we know, what we don't know, and put it in the appropriate context, right? And how we got that information. That's really, really key. And a lot of people, who are just reading the news don't necessarily recognize that. But there's a really good example of this is recently, of course, a lot of the kind of major news outlets were criticized over their coverage of Gaza. And one of the things that I noticed after a few months of that criticism, if you watch the really good news organizations that actually worked with people on the ground in Gaza, you started to see things like, this person told this, said this at this date, in this context, sitting next to somebody in the hospital, that the photo has been geolocated. And so you start to see, so very subtly, you start to see this kind of transparency, right? And then, of course, one of the third things in journalism that I try to teach my students is the idea of originality, right? Bearing witness. So I know that later we're going to have the discussion on doing your own research. And of course, I'm really eager for that. But part of, for journalism, doing your own research is actually bearing witness to something, observing it, being able to tell everybody who couldn't be there what was happening, actually reading the footnotes on the study and talking to the people that produced it, that sort of thing. And then, of course, and it's really important to get this information right, because if you don't, a lot of people know it. One of the old journalism adages is, if your mother loves you, check it out. We tell that to early students, right? That you can't really believe anything. The reason I say all of this, I was taking some notes yesterday, the reason I mention all of this is because I'm just really, I knew there would be a connection, but I was really surprised at listening to the speakers last night, talking to people at dinner, just how great the connection is between what this conference is about and what you're doing and being a good journalist. It's just, it feels really strong. So one of the reasons that Katie invited me is because I teach a lot of things around media literacy. And I teach media literacy in a lot of different ways, through journalism classes that are teaching students to be reporters and writers, senior seminars in like state government reporting. I also have a seminar that I teach called War, Peace, and the Media, where we look at narratives of conflict coverage. And so I really related to a lot of the conversations yesterday about good faith, because we've had a lot of controversial national events happen since I've been teaching that class. I've had students in my classroom at the same time who are both from Ramallah and who are from Tel Aviv. So And I also teach some GE media literacy classes. So I very much related to a lot of what you were saying about being discipline specific, right? And how hard it is to teach like a GE class and teach people to be inquisitive from a variety of different disciplines. But one of the things that has been guiding me in teaching media literacy has been this idea that if students know more about how the media works, that perhaps they will be more skeptical of it, right? If they understand how editors make decisions, if they understand how audiences influence what we see, if they understand how advertising interest works, issues with journalistic access, issues with the First Amendment, that perhaps it'll sort of lift the curtain and people will feel less conspiratorial towards media. Because one of the biggest challenges with teaching media and being a journalist is that obviously and we know this, that people don't trust us, and they see the reporter covering City Hall for a local nonprofit as the same as somebody on Newsmax, right? They don't necessarily make those distinctions, and it feels very mysterious. So I always encourage people, and actually most local publications actually welcome people from the community to sit in on news meetings and to listen to the editors make decisions. And so I would encourage you to do that, and I can connect you with that if you'd like. One of the places I worked very early in my career was the Modesto Bee, so I actually have worked in the Valley as a reporter. But lifting the curtain can be really useful for media literacy. However, it doesn't always work. And unlike some of you who said, I think last night, that you think in slides, that's not actually my genre. I think in these little notebooks, these reporters' notebooks. So, okay, perfect. So one of the things that has been challenging, though, about media literacy is that because students are inundated with media, right? I mean, 5 hours a day on TikTok, you have a lot of media. And what I have found is that they have a very, very high regard for their own media literacy. Now, I actually took these numbers from Inside Higher Ed because they seemed more reasonable than the numbers I was getting from my students. Because most of them, to be fair, while it is a GE class, I do have a lot of people from kind of communication and English and sort of the humanities. So I felt like maybe it was a little skewed. So this study was had a larger variety of majors included. But this is how students feel about their media literacy. That if you put high and somewhat high together, we're looking at like almost 3/4 of them think that they're really, really media literate, right? But they come into the classroom and they really have absolutely no idea how it works. They think it's sort of like some kind of Wizard of Oz thing, that there's an editor out there who's deciding what they have to know. And without actually going through, which there are actual steps and there are actually real things that are considered and can be justified. And of course, I'm talking about responsible news organizations here. I'm not necessarily talking about, a blog written by somebody with a Diet Dr. Pepper addiction in his mother's basement, or, any kind of like local Fox News thing. So, but what was interesting is that, there were only a few people who said really that they weren't media literate. And so there's this idea that a lot of people really don't know what media literacy means. So the idea is, again, trying to lift the curtain. And to that end, I'm not actually going to take the whole half hour to talk, I hope, but I wanted to also open it up to you all to ask any questions that you would like to about journalism. And Carlos can actually help me. There's other journalists in the room, right? So what actually did I find? And that is, so again, charts, not my strong suit, but I made these charts, and the blue represents DFW rates, which represents those students that got D's, F's, or had to withdraw. And the spring 2025 numbers were taken at midterms, to be fair. But this is pretty depressing, right? It's depressing in the beginning with fall 2023, 13%, spring of 24, 10%, and spring of 25, we have more than a quarter of students that are, and this is reflecting, and these are the same students who are saying that they feel that they have very strong media literacy skills. So there's this incredibly frustrating disconnect, and obviously we're still dealing with it. I clearly haven't figured out a solution yet, right? There's this frustrating disconnect, but I have noticed a really strange anomaly. And that is, I had students, the students that did really, really well over the years, they weren't necessarily, a lot of them were journalism majors, but not all of them. And they weren't necessarily like juniors or seniors. They were just, they were spread around. But there was this pocket of students that were really getting it and really doing well. And as much as I would like to say, oh, well, they had a great teacher, right? That wasn't it. There was something else going on. And so I started pulling these students' names who were doing really, really well. And what I found is they had something in common. They were all actually working in a profession, and to some degree. So these were the students that were doing well, that were working on the student newspaper. It's a student newspaper, but they're still. Or sometimes I would find students that were actually working in a field that they were training for. And that was the difference. It seemed to be a difference. Now it's not going to account for every difference, but there was a pattern that I found there. So what I've been working on is this idea of teaching media literacy values and connecting them to the professions. Because when there is a kind of economic or social imperative to engage in these media literacy skills, we're going to have more success. So we're going to remove the needle, so to speak. So for example, in journalism, we have something called the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And most journalists have this pasted somewhere on their wall. And they are things that reflect a lot of what we're talking about here. Being accurate, being factual, double checking things, asking questions. All of these things that we're talking about in terms of the values here, we're seeing in those. But what I decided to do is look around at some of the other professional ethics and see what they look like. Because again, if you don't follow these professional ethics as a journalist, you don't really have a job. At least at, again, legitimate news organization. You can't make things up and expect to stay in the industry, right? You can't make a lot of mistakes and expect to be successful, all of these things. And I always thought these ethics were really cool. But what I've discovered is a lot of other fields basically have very similar ethics. So what ended up, and my slides again, not the best. But these are a few things, and I will send these in case anybody wants to look at them later. These are just a few activities to sort of challenge their hubris about and I know that we're going to be talking about a lot of activities. These are just a few things that I pulled. One of them is a Pew Research quiz about facts versus opinion, which Claude and I have been debating about for the last 20 hours or so, right? And then there's one called Spot the Troll, which was created by academics, where students get a chance to guess who the troll is and what the real profile is. Another one is checking AI videos. And I also included here at the bottom, I included the previous presenters, which face is real AI. So thank you for that. I tested it out on some students, right? They got more than 50% wrong. On the students last week. And then there's another one that's just a kind of a photoshopped AI from the New York Times. So I try to use these things as a low stakes way to get them to think maybe I'm not as media literate as I thought I was. And they do this, and I just have them screenshot their results and send it to me, and it's a credit, no credit for doing it. So I try to remove the judgment from it. So that way they can start to say, okay, I actually got only 50% on this. Maybe there's some work to do. But but getting back to the idea of values. So I try to start with why media literacy matters. Again, to connect them with those professional values. So media shapes our beliefs and our behavior, of course. And they recognize that for the most part, I think intellectually, but they don't necessarily practice it. It's the same idea that was really surprising to a lot of journalists like me. So I worked as a newspaper reporter for many years before I went to academia. I call myself the accidental academic sometimes. And one of the things that we were really surprised at is surveys show over and over again that readers want stories about the environment and City Hall, but now we know what readers are actually looking at. And they're clicking on celebrity news and sports, and occasionally they click on real news if it's something that affects them. There was a big story in Sacramento because one of our freeways has been torn up for years because Caltrans screwed up their concrete contract. And so the idea is that media shapes our beliefs and our behaviors, and so they recognize that, and the students will say, yes, I want more investigative journalism about what's happening overseas, but they're watching cat videos on TikTok. Again, one of the most depressing things about AI for many of us is you can't even trust that the cat videos are real. And of course we know that it's easier than ever before to spread fake news. It's always been around. I always explain to students, since the first cave teen told their parents they were going to be home by midnight, fake news has always been around. And democracies need people who understand the facts to solve problems. But what I wrote in here is the discipline-specific priority. So for me, because I teach a lot of courses at the intersection of journalism and government, we talk a lot about democracy. But I think you can insert a lot of different things there because biologists need people who understand the facts to solve problems, right? Historians need that. All the different disciplines need people who understand the facts in order to solve problems. I saw a hand up there. Oh, okay. I'm totally okay if anybody has, I tend to talk kind of fast, so I'm totally okay if anybody has a question as we go through this. So I try to get them to understand, of course, to start to say, okay, media matters, media shapes us. What we look at is what we become. You are what you eat, right? You are what you consume. And it's important to consume information that is reliable, that is based in some kind of science, that is the information that is not designed to deceive, but designed to inform, looking at those things of intent. But again, that's hard to do it unless they have a real motivation. They will say it all day long. They will say but they need to have a motivation, and that's one of the things that, again, I'm exploring about that motivation of discipline-specific values. So this is a lot of links, and again, I only put them on there because I thought they might be helpful for you. I showed this presentation to my husband, who's also a journalist, before I left, and he said, those are the worst slides I think I've ever seen. So you don't put all of the words on slides. But what I put here is professional codes of different fields. I started with journalism, but I also put some professional codes of ethics for historians, for biomedical, and I just included these links because one of the things I noticed in combing through these, because I was looking for these for individual students. So now what I'm asking them to do is look at what their major is, look at what the professional standards say, and then look at how you can apply those professional standards to your media consumption. So I just took an example, and I specifically pulled out an example that is not my field, that is not journalism, and this is public relations. I don't think there's anybody in here in public relations, so this is actually probably a good thing because it allows us to be sort of free of judgment here. But I was looking at this, and it's like, okay, loyalty, fairness, independence, but I highlighted a few of the terms that we can then apply to our media consumption. Facts, right? And we think of PR, okay, since there aren't any PR people in here, we think of PR as, right, being spin and being, and we think of PR as being kind of, to some degree, misleading. As I tell students, It's not that they're lying, they're maybe just not telling you all the information that you need, right? But within those professional codes, there is this idea of facts, right? Because most professions recognize it really doesn't do any good to have false information out there. So facts, I highlighted that. Accuracy and truth. Now, it's not saying that you have to talk about every problem if you're representing a company and you don't have to talk about every problem they've ever had. Or you're representing a politician, you don't have to talk about, how they got suspended from high school, right? I mean, you don't have to necessarily have every problem, but the idea is what you do produce must be accurate and factual. And so so when students start to see that and be able to apply it, like I said, I just noticed those who were actually working in a field took it a little bit, did a lot better. Responsibly use specialized knowledge and research. So this idea of specialization and knowledge, things of course that we're talking about. Accountability is really common. It's a common phrase in a lot of it. And part of being accountable is being accurate. And so if you can so the goal now is to try to get students to really understand this and be able to apply this. So even if they're not necessarily engaged in majors that involve media, they can look at this and say, okay, I have to do these things. I have to be accurate. I have to prioritize getting good information for my own field, not just, to please this teacher, not just for my news consumption. Maybe they're not particularly interested in the news of the world. And so I had a couple things, and this is just a little add-on, and I'm really looking forward. I'm hoping I'm going to get a lot of ideas today. So I've already have so many, but I'm really looking forward to hearing kind of some suggestions. But one of the things that I've started to do in terms of really trying to promote this idea is using some of these and having them add it to everything that they cite. Because one of the things I try to do with media literacy is to make their assignments somewhat discipline specific, where they have to take something from what they are studying, rather than just having me assign something cool and interesting because it's something in the media. And of course, I'm going to tend to assign things that involve, investigative journalism and government and things like that. Things that, probably, some of them don't find that interesting. So instead, shifting and getting them to look at things that are within their discipline until, of course, the university system gives us enough resources to have critical thinking classes for every discipline, which I know that we're all interested in. So I have them add these questions to each work cited. It also helps guard a little bit, probably not entirely, against using AI sources. Because there was a lot of chatter yesterday in talking about how AI makes up sources. My dinner table was in a pretty interesting conversation about that. Thank you. About AI making. What was the statistic that only 15% were caught by peer review? I mean, which is just incredible. So I have them add these to their works cited to say when it was published, is it up to date? Because oftentimes, if it's not, that can be a real clue that something's off. And of course, as we know, we're always updating ourselves, right? I mean, 2,000 years ago in the course of human history, probably not that long ago, and that's when we were all about astrology, right? That was like that was all about science. So we look at authority, who is the source and are they credible? Now, what they have to do for this part of the assignment is they have to actually look up the source, like find a legitimate biography of them. Are they affiliated with a university? Are they, have they produced a book that has been well received? What is their experience level? That sort of thing. So really kind of looking at their resume. Are they in a position to know about the information that they're saying? So maybe they're, well, you used RFK as an example. I thought you were going to put up one of those fake photos of Trump with Pope Francis that were all over the internet for a while when we were talking about how to describe AI. But you had that picture of RFK, and does he have a medical degree? So it's that sort of thing, like getting them to really think in that way. Accuracy, which can be hard to determine for students who maybe don't know a whole lot about their topic. But one of the things that they can look at is how much evidence is in the article, right? How much evidence is there? Are they citing any studies? Where are those studies from? What is the evidence? Okay, they're claiming this thing, but where's the evidence in it? Because there's lots of things, of course, that we see claimed, particularly on social media all the time. And more, I would say that more than half my students say that they primarily get their information from social media. And for us, that may not be a bad thing if we're connected with other people at universities and we're connected with journalists, and we could get a pretty good idea of the world. But my guess is that the average 20-year-old's algorithm doesn't look like ours. So I asked them about evidence in the article. Now we can talk later about whether or not that evidence is that's the next levels to talk about how good that evidence is. But first they need to see, okay, what evidence is being provided, or are these just statements? And then we talk about relevance, right? Does the evidence actually back up the conclusion? Because sometimes you see in articles that where students are trying to test the veracity of information, where they say that there's a whole lot of evidence, but that evidence is actually kind of a sidebar or off track from what the major conclusions are. So getting them to think in that way can be helpful too. And then the other thing, and this is really sort of where we think a lot in journalism, is the purpose, right? Who is the audience and what is this article communicating to them? Because if we can determine who the audience is, that can give us a real window into how accurate the information is. Who is the audience? Is the audience hyper-partisan voters? Well, that information is going to look different. And sometimes the hyper-partisan website news outlets are not entirely wrong, but they're just missing information, or they're contextualizing it in ways that lead us to false conclusions, or they oversimplify, which is what we see a lot of. So this has been really useful, and they don't like it, just to be honest, because it's more work. I'm basically asking them to tack on a one-page essay to everything that they cite. So they don't like me. but I found that their sources are a lot better once I started to tack this on. A couple other things and these are just my instructions. And then I have them, in addition to that, explain why they think the source is trustworthy. Now, some of them will be really annoying when they do this, and they will say something like, well, you said Johns Hopkins was a good source. That's all I'll get from them, right? Or they'll say, well, you're always giving us articles from the New York Times, so that's a good source. But I do try to get them, actually that's helpful information, because it's like, okay, if they're just relying on a brand, and we all rely on brands a lot, if they're just relying on a brand, is that really enough to be media literate in a post-truth world? And I think that we can argue that it's not. I mean, it's helpful and it's a guide, but as much as I love some of the traditional news outlets like the New York Times, they get it wrong sometimes. I mean, anybody remember WMD? Like, they got it wrong. And so there are mistakes, and we need to understand that. We can't just blindly follow one news outlet or one study. So this is just kind of a fun activity. We won't necessarily I wasn't planning on going through it, but just a fun activity that I like to use to really help again with media literacy, and that's fact-checking political ads. I included a couple. They're pretty outdated, but they're pretty great. I mean, one is a pro-Trump one where he's not even in the ad, but it talks about how defunding the police, and the police is 911 is on an answering machine, and then it has images of people lighting things on fire and streets in chaos. And of course, there's no like detail of where that's from. I mean, we're supposed to think it's from a protest. I mean, it could be from an Ohio State-Michigan game. We don't know. But and then there's another video, which is a really famous ad that Hillary Clinton did, which shows which has Donald Trump's voice talking about things like about the way that women look, and it's showing 13-year-old girls criticizing themselves in the mirror, right? So they're both really powerful, but they're both, you know, there's no context to them. There's no evidence of where the information came from. So I find political ads can be kind of a fun way to get students to engage in some of those media literacy skills. And I simply just use these questions, factual arguments. And first they have to define what are they presenting as a fact, and then we look at if they're valid or not, if there's evidence for it. We talk about the emotional arguments, the idea that these are things that are designed to make us feel angry, right? There's a reason 90% of fake news, or that's not an exact number, but the vast majority of fake news is negative, right? Because it's designed to scare and anger. Those are the emotions that really drive a lot of these things. People aren't necessarily going to click on good information. And then who's paying for it, which is a whole nother part of media literacy. I had no idea I was talking so much. Thank you so much. But I'll be around. I'm happy to answer any of your questions about how journalism works. And I'm happy to share my slides if anybody wants them. Thank you so much.